Well, learning to do watercolor is a series of solving problems. Break it down. And the more you can break it down, whether it be technique or subject or color, the more you can practice and hone those individual small things. Sky, land, water, rocks, trees, tree boughs, as we saw in the last video. And that even goes for vegetation on the ground. This can be really fun to study. Quick, easy, and just a good way to solve little problems so you don't have to wait till you're doing a whole scene. Let's go paint some vegetation. Well, I'm going to start painting some of these, and I'm just keeping them very small, really little clumps of weeds. I'll do sort of a little scene after this, but I want to just practice some vegetation, weeds and underbrush and stuff you find at your feet when you're walking through the woods or wherever. This first one was a little bit spontaneous. Wasn't looking at a whole lot. I was looking at a couple things, but I didn't have a plan, so it's a little bit rough. And I intended this first one to be mainly a warm-up. I get my gouache feet under me. And I'm using gouache here because this I felt was the best, easiest, most spontaneous way to practice. If I didn't like what I was doing, I could easily cover it up or lift it and cover it up. You could just as well practice this with transparent watercolor too, so it's not a big deal. I wanted to practice doing some things that involve deep color with maybe some light highlights over the top, maybe contrasted with lighter backgrounds, things like that. But also the shapes, that come into little grasses and weeds and things. All right, real quickly, I thought I would show you what I'm using for reference. I've alluded to this in other videos, and I do this quite frequently. This is my Pinterest page, and I post a lot of inspirational stuff on here, almost none of my own art. I do have my videos. What I'll be using is the reference category that I created, and I have created a subcategory called Vegetation and Ground. And in it, you will find a whole bunch of mostly concept artists. Concept artists usually work digitally, most of the time for video games and movies, entertainment, that sort of thing. But some of the concept art is just great for getting ideas. It's a good example. So if you're talking about underbrush and vegetation, got a lot of ideas. I won't be putting up any of these images while I paint because I'm not copying any of them verbatim. I'm using them as idea starters. So just wanted to get that out there. And while I use this for my own inspiration, these boards are public and you can look at them if you'd like. My Pinterest is at S Mitchell Design. Yeah, so this one here got a little bit overworked. And so I ended up having to go through and blend out and kind of reconnect some of the deep shapes. I am using the Hanamola Toned Gray watercolor sketchbook. It is not a cotton sketchbook. I have found that they work really good for gouache. They also do really well for line and wash, pen and ink with simple washes. The brushes I'm using are the Etcher gouache brush set. It's a set I like really well. They're just good watercolor brushes, not just for gouache. So I'm just bringing in some final highlights here to that little weed clump there. Kind of trying to go back and simplify some of the stuff around that little weed clump to the right, and just adding a little bit of feature to that back bit. Simple, fun, pretty easy. This one is a bit of a small scene. One of the things that I saw on my Pinterest reference was a little waterfall scene. I thought it made a good occasion to kind of bring in some surrounding foliage, and that's what I'm doing. So I'm using gouache here a little bit more transparently, the way you would typically use transparent watercolor. And I just decided to establish a dark and light pattern of ground and rocks and, the ledges that the water was running over. So that's what I'm doing. But again, gouache is great for doing some of these studies because if you don't like what you did or you want to refine it, you can cover it up. And gouache also lifts much easier than standard transparent watercolor. It also blends much easier than standard transparent watercolor. It blends after it's dry, in other words. So here's my dark and light background pattern, and now it's just a matter of getting in some of those foliage bits. And if you saw my last video, this is a very similar exercise, at least in the vegetative bits. You're studying shapes and the shapes that this stuff makes as it clumps together. So I'm being fairly detailed and chaotic here, but that's because I know I'm using gouache, and a lot of this I can blend together and simplify as I go. So that's another advantage to gouache. And to get some of that moss and small vegetation on those rocks. And here you can see me blending it out. When I blend gouache, like you see me doing here, it's with a damp brush, but not wet. So if you get a lot of water on the page with gouache, you'll just end up with a mess. It'll lift it, it'll turn it into a little pool. So what you want to do is you want a damp brush, but you want just barely damp so that it just loosens up the color that you're wanting to blend. And now we're just going to put in some water. Didn't have to do this part, but hey, why not? I haven't painted a waterfall in a while. A little brook or stream running through a little tropical jungle area. As I mentioned in my little bit where I showed you the reference I'm using, this is done. I don't see it done a lot with watercolorists. Some do, but this is done a lot. These little breakdowns into studying bits and pieces of a scene. This is done a lot by concept artists. I mean, just a whole lot. You'll see entire pages filled with just little clumps of grass, different kinds of trees, little ways of treating rocks. I think it's a great way to study the elements of landscape, particularly if they're ones that you have trouble with or you don't understand. That's kind of what this is all about. It's understanding. And then looking at it and seeing if you got it, represented it to a state where you feel like you do understand it. If you didn't, then you problem solve. You say, well, why not? Let me compare it to the reference or to something like a photo that will tell me what would make it look better or what would give me a little better understanding. Now I'm going to do a couple of small ones. I saw an example of some sort of lily pads over a stream. I'm just isolating out a few of the lily pads. At least they look kind of like lily pads. And I did not paint those opaquely. One way to do this would have been to put down a dark background and then opaquely paint those lily pads. But when you do that with gouache, you get into a lot of lifting problems and intermixing with the underlying paint layer and the top paint layer. So I treated that at least like transparent watercolor. Painted in those yellow-green shapes and then painted a dark background around it. Now I'm just going to go through and add some features to those leaves. It's a simple little study. And I want to pull out some shadows, and a few surface features to make those leaves come forward or move back, add some dimension. That's the goal here. The light play on the leaves was something that interested me and I wanted to capture. And now I'm just going to add some little vines and things around it. Give it a little more context. There's just some really great environmental artists out there, concept artists doing landscape. Might be landscape, might be interiors and buildings and stuff, but I'll tell you the landscape ones I've seen, such as I showed you in the reference. Well, some of it will just blow you away. And one last little final one, just a sort of a clump of, I don't know what it is, leaves with some flowers on it. Thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for supporting this channel. Here's the finished pieces, a final look. We'll see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.